Right, I'm going to get going. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this morning's webinar. My name's Gemma McCall, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Culture Shift. We are a tech for good platform, and we exist to make the world a safer, happier, and more supportive place for everyone everywhere. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Georgina Halford-Hall, who is the CEO of Whistleblowers UK and the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Whistleblowing. Georgina has spearheaded their case for bolstering protections for whistleblowers in the UK, as well as helping whistleblowers successfully defend their cases at tribunal. Working with the APPG on whistleblowing, she has supported efforts to establish a new Office of the Whistleblower, which is a project to deliver effective protection for whistleblowers, sanctions for abusers, and education for the public on all of their rights. It would be great to know where you're joining from today, so please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves, introduce your organisation and where in the country or indeed the world you're joining us from. We welcome all your questions and healthy discussion during the webinar in the chat. However, there should be no inappropriate use of the chat function, and we consider inappropriate use to be explicit or offensive language, and we will not be allowing any intimidation, bullying or harassment of any kind. There is a chat moderator present on the webinar, and if they feel that you're failing to adhere to this code of conduct, which I think you all would agree is fair, you may be given a warning via private message. So the work being done by Whistleblowers UK is incredibly interesting, and today we're going to be spending some time learning a bit about the new bill and about the overlap between the work being done by Georgina and her team, the work that we do here at Culture Shift in challenging interpersonal misconduct and creating safer environments for people to speak up about negative behaviours. Whistleblowing is so often thought to be about disclosing information about illegal or fraudulent activity or unsafe behaviours as far as they relate to health and safety. But there is so much overlap in the work being done by Whistleblowers UK and the work that we're doing at Culture Shift to tackle misconduct and transform organisational cultures. So that's one of the reasons why we thought it was important to hold this webinar today. The backlash felt by whistleblowers that WB UK aims to address with the Protection for Whistleblowing Bill mirrors that felt by everyone who chooses to speak up to protect organisational cultures. The Protection for Whistleblowing Bill will increase protections for all those who speak up and correct our current legislation where it fails to truly hold accountable those responsible for ensuring anyone that speaks up is protected from any harm. Today, I wanted to sit down with Georgina and learn more about that bill, understand what change organisational leaders should expect, and discuss how the bill might impact organisational cultures over time. So good morning, Georgina.
Good morning, Gemma, and thank you for such a very kind and generous welcome. It's a delight to be here with you today and also to be working with you in some of these important messages and how we help to transform behaviour together, one step at a time. Thank you.
Definitely. So I'm going to get into my first question. And I think, unfortunately, whistleblowing can sometimes be seen to have a bad reputation and can often be an off-putting process, if we call it that, for people who are considering doing it. But how would you describe whistleblowing at its core?
I think the sound has gone wrong. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, that's been muted now.
Okay. Whistleblowing is a fundamental action that all of us participate in all of the time. There is absolutely no difference with people speaking out when they see something wrong. In fact, I'm going to roll back from that. I'm just going to use my normal phrase. It's normal. Speaking up is a totally normal, legitimate activity of every human being. And it's instinctive to us. And it's instinctive because we all know the difference between right and wrong. And we have instinct internally and our own internal mechanisms that enable us to identify and not only the wrongdoing, but also urge us in the necessity to do something about it. no different to if you see, a toddler walking towards a naked flame, for instance. You want to reach out. It's a normal thing to try and prevent it. And what's more, it's never just one person that's seen this. There's always more than one person aware. And I think what never fails to surprise me is the amount of people who stand by and wait for somebody else to do something about it. And therefore, within the work that you're doing and we're doing, I think that's all part of the importance of that process and cultural shift, to use your name, in order to ensure that people feel not only safe to act upon their normal urges and instincts, but also supported, and that the organisations within which they are speaking out are prepared and they are also able to respond appropriately. So I think that this idea that whistleblowing has a bad reputation, I think that's a myth that's grown up around all of this. And that it's not that whistleblowing's got a bad reputation, it's about the people who cover up or try and put a lid on it, suppress the people who are speaking out. That's where the bad reputation issue might arise, because of the discomfort that they feel in being perhaps potentially held to account, or the guilt that they feel for not responding in the right way. But it comes back to instinct. And we all know that when we feel personally attacked, we can behave in a way which is perhaps something we might regret later. We pull down the drawbridge, we want to turn that focus onto somebody else. And what we are seeing is it is exactly that in much of the retaliation. And it's about the unstoppability of it once it gets started. We've coined a model, we've put together a model called the cycle of abuse. And it may help for organisations to understand what that looks like. And, you normally you start out with several people identifying or talking about the issue, whatever it may be. And then for whatever reason, one of the group breaks ranks and speaks out. Now, quite frequently within the original group, there's a manager or somebody with the authority, or even a prescribed person, as it's called under the existing law, who's within that group, but they don't do anything either. It's when the person steps outside and says, enough is enough, you need to do something, or we want somebody to do something. It's your job as the manager, for instance, to do it. What then happens, and we've identified this over thousands of pieces of evidence, is that those managers who are supposed to take the action go and seek advice from somewhere like HR or in-house legal, phone a friend. And I don't think it starts out malicious. It's purely that human instinct to defend ourselves. What do I do? It's outside of my normal working, what I see as my job. And often they get poorly advised. At which point we start to investigate the whistleblower. Back to instinct. When something is happening, we feel it inside. We know when something is different. You can't always put your finger on it, but we know when something is different. And then people behave differently. Behavior breeds behavior. We end up then in disciplinaries, on this topic of bullying, which I know is very close to your heart, and ending it, is that whistleblowers start to feel intimidated, bullied, harassed themselves. And their defense mechanisms often can be interpreted as them being aggressive, them being difficult. And so they then start to become labelled, and we investigate the whistleblower and not the whistleblowing. Ultimately, the ways often part, or the whistleblower just withdraws, and often they move on. And all of those activities actually avoiding dealing with the central issue, which is the whistleblowing, which could be about corruption or fraud or patient harm or bullying and harassment or racial discrimination, all incredibly important issues. And what then happens is, we call it a cycle of abuse, because the next unsuspecting person comes in who equally believes in the company and its policies, its procedures, its code of conduct. They raise the alarm, they put their head above the parapet, and they then fall into the cycle as well. And we've seen this a lot within the NHS and many of the reports that have come out. Bill Kirkup's report, particularly around maternity scandal, references the silencing of whistleblowers and the tactics they used. So I would say, coming back to the original question, and my apologies for a lengthy answer, is that whistleblowing is a great thing. It's the thing that organisations must encourage if they want to succeed. And I refer to it as reputation, resilience, and retention. So if you have a good whistleblowing policy with a genuinely open and transparent system surrounding it, you will enhance your reputation, because let's face it, things go wrong everywhere. We all see it. You know, you must have done as a leader, I certainly have. And there are times when I've thought, my goodness, if only I'd known sooner, or perhaps on reflection, I could have handled that better. And that's about the honesty in all of this and being professional. But we want to retain our best staff as opposed to losing them, which is what happens with whistleblowers, really sadly. And then this thing about resilience, organisational resilience is the organisation that can get over these little humps. And if they deal with them at the very lowest possible level, the likelihood is that the whistleblower isn't going to need to go outside of their organisation, that's never going to become a statistic, that the organisation will itself feel good about how it's dealt with something. And then potentially, rather than having to discipline people, they'll be looking at, how do we re-educate? It'll be about driving that culture into a more positive space, which will in turn make it more attractive to people who want to come and work there and those who want to stay. So a very long answer to a fairly short question, and I hope I've come to your points.
No, definitely. And I think the thing is, it was never going to be a short answer, because you know, where whistleblowing starts and ends, I think, is like a really interesting sort of topic in and of itself. And it's really the sort of fundamentals to it are creating that speak up culture, but also something that you've talked about in the past is that listening culture as well. So it's all very well encouraging people to speak up if and when something is wrong, but it's how the organisation listens and responds in a kind of open and, I guess, sometimes vulnerable way, instead of just going, right, actually we need to suppress, cover this up, because we don't want to admit that we are fallible and that sometimes that we make mistakes. Because I think the perception is admitting that there has been a mistake is going to be expensive. Actually, what we're seeing, you know, more and more with more high profile whistleblowing cases successfully going through to tribunal, that is the much more expensive route, you know, so expensive, we'll come onto it later, that it's almost incalculable, the expense to the organisation when a whistleblowing case escalates and goes wrong. I'd really like to talk about the current legislation, which is at the moment is the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998, which is kind of referred to generally as PIDA. I'd really love to understand your like from your perspective what the strengths and weaknesses of that legislation are, and then talk about the journey to introducing the new whistleblowing bill and how that new bill builds on the current legislation and why you think it's necessary.
Have we got 3 hours? I'm good. So let's start with the Public Interest Disclosure Act. I think the Public Interest Disclosure Act is a really important pivotal piece of legislation. It's been something that set the UK apart from most other countries, including America. It did something really important, which is raise the issue of whistleblowing. It brought it more into our consciousness. And it came on the back of some really important and devastating issues like the Zeebrugge ferry. when all of those people died because somebody didn't press the right button. So the checks and balances were not in place. And everyone knew about it. Nobody did anything. Where the Public Interest Disclosure Act has failed is that it was embedded in employment legislation. And it sits around this term worker. And of course, the world of work has changed drastically since 1998. We no longer work in the same ways, and it's excluded contractors, charity trustees, and so on until recently, judges. So many people have sat outside of this, and that in itself has caused huge amounts of misery, and it's allowed untold amounts of harm to continue. And by harm, I mean everything from fraud to child abuse. We need legislation that actually protects people who speak out. And with the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and you'll forgive me if I slip into the term PIDA, and it sits inside the Employment Rights Act, so it can be amended. It's there only retrospectively, and it's only for detriment that you experience. So if you're a whistleblower who speaks up, you have to experience detriment for this to kick in to protect you, which understandably, given these high profile cases that you referenced, where people were not protected and they have experienced huge amounts of detriment, the message that it sends out is, don't whistleblow, it's not good for your health. And I sat on a panel recently with my friends and colleagues over at Protect, and Liz Gardner then said, what we advise people to do is leave their job, get another job before they speak up. And I think that in itself makes the argument for why we need new legislation. And this new legislation that we have put together has not been any independent individual thought from me or my team. We've looked at whistleblowers and their feedback. We have looked at other organisations and what they have put together. We have looked at even another piece of legislation that was proposed by Philippa Whitford, all of which have got brilliant pieces of legislation and policy embedded into them that supports speaking out, that supports not only whistleblowers, that supports organisations to help them to do the right thing. Because what PIDA does is it pushes people into this litigious nightmare, and it is a nightmare. You've mentioned cost, and I'm sure we'll come on to what that cost looks like, and I'll be interested to hear what some of the people in the audience think is the cost beyond the human cost. That this piece of legislation is about protecting whistleblowers, removing them from the medieval torture chamber that is the employment tribunal, and giving them a safe space and a safety net. It doesn't mean you can't go through your organisation's internal mechanisms and report in that way. And I would always advise people to try and get people to look at and understand those policies and procedures before they engage with them. I think work in order to give some top tips to employers and organisations more generally, they need to know what these policies and procedures say. They shouldn't be a tick box, a certificate of training on the wall. It has to be embedded into your performance framework so that everybody knows what it is. We know what our equality policies look like, but very few people actually know what whistleblowing is or what their policies and procedures look like. And I know from the people who contact us every year that our first question is, what does your policy say? And then we can move on probably later in this conversation to what happens when organisations don't abide by their own policies and procedures, because I saw that come up in the chat. And it is unfortunately a reality. And it's something that then that comes into detriment in the employment tribunal. So this legislation is about separating the whistleblower from the whistleblowing and protecting them, ensuring that not just investigations, it's in the top drawer, proper, effective and meaningful investigations are conducted. And where possible, those outputs and outcomes are communicated not only to the whistleblower, but also to the organisation more widely. And it's not about pinning a badge on a whistleblower and, parading them around. It's about talking in a mature way about how respected whistleblowing is and how important it is to the success of the organisation, and talking and demonstrating the impact, again, without shining a spotlight on the whistleblower. There are many of us who would like to have congratulations, but that can all be done through the normal processes. When I talk about rewards and recognition, I'm not talking about, like an Olympic medal here. I'm talking about those more low-key but recognition points that we do as we do through normal performance management. And that's what will make organizations flourish.
So do you mean sort of, sorry to interrupt there, but do you mean like kind of recognition and reward, for want of a better word, for kind of your calling it out and near misses, from, if you kind of talk from a health and safety like perspective, and really like encouraging that rather than suppressing and ignoring the thing that's been flagged?
You're absolutely right, because most whistleblowers describe their whistleblowing as they were just doing the right thing or just doing their job. They're the two key phrases we hear all the time. An organisation should normally be looking at how they recognise people who do their job properly, even when it's a bit inconvenient, flagging up, those dusty corners that we've forgotten to clean. Those are the things that we need to deal with. And also it could be around people who are popular, that they've always seemed to be bomb-proof. And we've seen that with some of the things that are coming out around popular, stars. Celebrities. I don't want to be naming names, but it hasn't ended well. And all of the people are in some way corrupted by their collusion and their failure to act at an earlier point. And the Emperor's New Clothes keeps coming to mind over and over again. So it's about these investors coming back from the investigations. It's also about sanctions. It's about ensuring that where actions are taken to suppress whistleblowers, that adequate sanctions are in place. And we are proposing in the bill that we've drafted that is going through Parliament that fines and penalties are in there, not just for organisations, but also for the individuals concerned. And I don't want to dwell on that, because I rather think that what has been put together with the generosity and help of so many people in the public domain, whether they know it or not, is something that will drive good behaviour, positive behaviour, proactive behaviour, will make organisations want to do it right. And I think what PIDA did was it's completely clouded that by making it a litigation. Litigation, the first point of call, making it very combative, and not looking at sorting the employment, the should we call it the dispute out first, or looking at the concerns first, and turning a concern into a dispute, which is a really bizarre and perverse way of dealing with somebody who's actually doing the thing you've employed them to do in the first place.
So PIDA, you think, kind of is to only offers protection in a kind of in a way where the situation is just too far beyond, it's too far gone, the harm has happened, the harm continues to happen, and it's a way for whistleblowers to seek compensation for that, rather than being active and preventative at the sort of beginning end.
You're absolutely spot on there. And what it then drives, as I saw in the chat, I'll steal your words because you're really helping me, it's about it, rather than a positive culture, that kind of negative behavior drives a toxic culture, and we end up with toxic workplaces. And what we're looking for in our bill, and I know it uses the word compensation, but the reality is it's restitution. It's about ensuring that morally correct or contractually correct action is recognised in a way that it should be. Because let's face it, if you start, we've got all this stuff around compensation culture, but the compensation in the employment tribunals never ever recognises the toll it takes on the individual to bring these cases in the first place. And in over 25 years, not a single case or rather the Employment Tribunal have told us that not a single case has been passed to law enforcement or to a regulator. So whistleblowers spend months and years now, putting together their evidence, gathering it, fighting many fights to get disclosure. And guess what? Nothing is ever done with it. And so what we find, as in many of these reports, is lots of people have reported the same thing. They don't know each other, but nothing's been done about it. It's escalated. And in terms of the NHS, which is really dear to my heart, people die. And good staff leave. You know, we've seen the figures this week for hundreds of thousands of people leaving. Exodus. It's like an exodus. We're not going to get them to stay unless we put in place things that recognise the importance of speaking out when they are concerned. Doesn't matter if they're not right. The fact that they're speaking up is that open and honest, transparent culture, which are more than words on a poster on the back of the toilet door, which is what we see far too often. And our bill fundamentally is a champion for all whistleblowers and a champion for whistleblowing itself. It's got the Office for the Whistleblower embedded in it that will set the standards for minimum standards for policies, procedures and reporting platforms. It'll be there to test them, to ensure that they're working properly and that organisations get the support. Because if you don't give organisations the support, which PIDA doesn't, what we end up with, again, is everyone's afraid of it. This is about making it accessible and providing a safety net to every single citizen, because wording in our bill is absolutely explicit. It recognises and sets out in law what whistleblowing is, who a whistleblower is, because under PIDA, and I could go on about this all day, I'd probably be I'll be a bore on whistleblowing. I don't want to be that for your
No.
Here in our bill, we've taken the reality that organisations do hunt for whistleblowers. They do look for their friends. They do isolate them. And where you've got an organisation where several members of the family work there, they can all be targets. You have managers and HR directors. Baroness Kramer uses this amazing phrase that she's coined, having met so many people, which is you end up with a pile of whistleblowers, but only the one at the bottom who's made the protected disclosures is protected. And quite frequently they've gone off and they're quite happy thinking somebody else is doing something, but the others haven't recognised, and they are then being targeted. What our legislation does is protect all of those people. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not going to say it's perfect. And I'm certainly not going to say it's going to go without a hitch. But it's got to be an improvement on where we are now.
Yeah, definitely. You referenced there that pile of whistleblowers, and you also talked about like multiple people unfortunately like being targeted for their kind of when they've spoken up about something, and often they haven't even realized that they've blown the whistle on something, potentially deeper and bigger. And the work we do at Culture Shift really revolves around culture change. It evolves around specifically addressing behavioural misconduct, such as harassment, discrimination and bullying in the workplace. How does the new whistleblowing bill relate to those more interpersonal behaviours, do you think?
Well, ultimately, it's about stopping the issues that cause those interpersonal disputes in the first place. So I think that's where it really comes in. But under PIDA, let's not, I'm not decrying it. I think it's had an important role to play, but it's like everything, we used to have CD players. We've now got, Bluetooth and goodness knows what else. I'm technically totally inept, but this is
things move on and things develop, and like you said right earlier, when that act came in 1998, if you just think about the last 3 years in the world of work, given what we've been through with COVID, things have completely transformed. In 1998, online harassment was not a thing, was not a consideration. Now that is something that people face day in, day out. So, you know, like the world has changed and the legislation hasn't kept up with it, I think is the sort of important element, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Anyone who's Googled this will find that, again, Protect and Whistleblower's UK, not I, we don't always agree on things. They want to keep PIDA, they want to see some secondary legislation. We think that that's foolish, because that is a totally discredited piece of legislation that relies on the Employment Tribunal. And what we've done with this bill is we've again listened to whistleblowers. We've ensured that parliamentarians across every colour actually get this. And everyone agrees that the Employment Tribunal is the wrong place to hear whistleblowing concerns. And that by removing that from the Employment Tribunal, you lift the weight off of the whistleblower and you put the emphasis on the office of the whistleblower to ensure that where organisations have failed, that they are ensuring that adequate and proper investigations take place. They're not hiding in the top drawer, that it's not part of this new industry that's sprung up to do, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And in line with what you're doing in terms of cultural shift, it's about helping people to understand what it feels like to sometimes get it wrong, how uncomfortable that can be, but also the positivity of putting it right, of how we own up to something without making ourselves feel bad about it, and how we support those people who've done the right thing, even when they haven't necessarily all been totally right either. Because we're not saying this about heroes or villains, but I do want to make the point that moving this out of the employment tribunals is a massive step forward. So arguments and disputes about whether or not restitution should be payable, and it will be money because that's what most people want, or an apology or so on, but mostly people want to be compensated because it's about their losses, and that this is two Goliaths. It's two organisations with lots of money, and they can fight it out. And they obviously have many cases because ultimately where it sits as a non-governmental body, but within that remit. So sorry about that. So in all honesty, we've forgotten to talk about the public interest, because isn't it about the public interest here? And it's in the public interest to ensure that concerns, however small, are improperly looked at, that bullying and harassment, be it online, be it in person, be it somewhat hidden, victimization, all of those things in this modern society have no place. So this whole culture shift that we are all striving towards has got to be underpinned by a piece of serious, sensible, practical and enforceable legislation. And that's what we believe we've got the makings of here. And that's what lots of politicians believe too. And it is only the parliamentary process and, shall we just say, the mess that Westminster has got itself into at the moment that is delaying much of this and other important pieces of legislation like that on anti-bullying in itself that's going through at the moment, getting a hearing this week actually. We all need to be getting behind it, and we can shape the future together, because it's that being together that will take things forward, not just in organisations, but all the way through right up to legislative levels. We don't all have to agree on everything, but what we do have to agree on is that what we have at the moment doesn't work. There isn't one right solution, but we can get it right between us, working together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think also the urgency to proactively prevent things from happening rather than react and set things right once they have been once the harm has been done. That has to be where the attention goes. And I think in terms of the fact that the proposed office for the whistleblower has the ability to give sanctions to organisations and individuals, I think that mix of carrot and stick is really important, because without the stick, unfortunately, organisations don't pay attention unless it's going to cost them a lot of money, you know, which over time defending these whistleblowing cases absolutely does, but it's a sort of small, it's over time it costs a lot of money rather than like kind of one sanction, like, you know, bam, you've been fined hundreds of thousands of pounds. That is the thing that, combined with the reputational damage, is the thing that organizations want to avoid. And I think that's why it's really important that you've got that mix of like carrot and stick, even though I know you don't want to, you know, focus loads on the sanctions, but I think having some teeth makes a regulator be taken seriously.
You're absolutely right. The biggest criticism and concern that we've heard from whistleblowers and actually from regulators themselves is about the lack of teeth. Within the regulatory circles, it's been very much about lack of resources. But I think there's also a lack of ambition, that people are very much in their comfy slippers, and that they taking on this, they see it as being a bit of a, you know, a poisonous pot. I personally don't think it is. I think we have to see whistleblowing for what it really is, which is about saving lives. It's about saving money, acting early. And if you use, and I don't want to, there may be people here who've had serious illnesses, but everyone knows that if you notice a symptom and act on it early, or if somebody points out a symptom to you and you act on it early, the likelihood is that the disease will not get worse, or if it does, it's going to be better controlled. I'm sorry for my health analogy, but I would live in a world where most of the people I speak to every day, in fact already 4 this morning, are all from health. And
that prevention is better than cure is, you know, is well, you know, it's a well-known sort of fact, isn't it? And I think that is that organizations should be taking, you know, preventative measures. And I think that sort of brings me on to my next question, actually. In light of the fact that this legislation is moving through the palaces of Westminster at the moment, what should organizational leaders be preparing for in order to be ready, not to react once this comes in, but to set their stall out and be proactive and be ready? How can they get ahead of the bill and start sowing the seeds of change today?
Well, let's start by saying that many organisations, I think, are already doing quite a good job. It's organisations aren't bad. It's people within them that choose the wrong path. So it's about reflecting on, looking at your policies, procedures, and, you know, we've all heard the term open door, but how often when you see one person coming towards you, do you want to kick it shut and hide under the desk? Come on, that is the nature of this. Organisations often are quite negative about these people who want to speak up, but they only become tenacious and keep bringing it up when nothing's been done, back to doing it at the earliest possible opportunity. So my message to organisations remains the same, and I talk to lots of organisations every month, is go back to your policies and procedures, and first of all, before you open them, ask yourself, what do I know about it? Am I familiar with it? In practice, what does good look like here? How does it really work? And am I being honest with myself in evaluating this? I'd be asking all boards to put a standing item on their agenda to say, whistleblowing. How many reports have we had? Now, if you're an organisation of, you know, 2 people, the likelihood is none, because you talk to each other all the time. But if you're an organisation like the big oil and gas companies and banks and, dare I say, the NHS, there should be literally hundreds. One of the general counsel at one of the big oil and gas companies that I've had the pleasure of talking to about the bill and about their feedback on it, and it wasn't all positive, I can assure you. There's a bit of defensiveness in there, but what they said is that they actually have calculated how many whistleblowing reports they should get every month. and they know where they should come from. And if they don't see them, they send people out to go and find out what's going on. Now, I think that that's a really great piece of best practice. Not only are you're hunting for whistleblowers in a good way, you're actually saying, why is my organization's not perfect? And in doing so, their thoughts are to avoid huge future fines, again, prevention is better than cure, to put in place training, to make staffing changes, to even change board members. And coming onto the role of the board, it isn't enough for them to sit on a committee, the same as trustees in charities. What we really need to be seeing is a lot more proactivity, because I think there will come a point where shareholders are given much more of a legal responsibility, but that's somewhat way further down the line. But if I'm running a large organisation, or even a small one as I do, I want to know that everybody understands what policies and procedures are, everybody understands how they work, and we want to test them and have mystery shopping, make sure that it does work. I tested with one of the regulators, by just telephoning their helpline, having been told how wonderful it was. And it was answered by somebody who, in the end, said, that sounds really complicated. Do you have a lawyer?
Right.
So you can see how it doesn't take a huge amount of effort to invest in even one of your own people, just testing out the system. Because we wouldn't think about not testing the brakes on our car, or the locks on our doors, or the batteries on our lights, and so on. So why don't we test these policies and procedures, and not just the whistleblowing one, but all of the interrelated ones? Why don't we merge and consolidate policies and procedures and make it that this is just how we are around here? This is our behaviour. So code of conduct, everything embedded in it. Why don't we change the language and stop talking about discipline and grievance? Why don't we talk about raising concerns and understand that whistleblowing is the technical term, but most people are fairly afraid of that term, because it feels like they're doing something extraordinary. When we come back to the beginning, we say, we're just doing my job, we're just doing the right thing. Look at how we can make it more accessible to everybody. And ensure that you go out and you, not just a survey, but managers go back to the floor. We saw those great TV programs. Is it working? And ask myself, is it working? Would I trust whistleblowing here? So that would be my thoughts for how they would do it. But I would also say that every organisation, not just the whistleblower Office for the Whistleblower, should be a champion for whistleblowers and whistleblowing, because it's in their best interests to be so.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that when you talk about best practice there is that organisation that you referenced who are worried if they don't get a minimum of X number of concerns being raised on a monthly basis. And I think that's exactly the right attitude to have. From our perspective, what we see across the organisations that we work with is kind of three different situations. When they implement our reporting system, you either get a healthy balance between anonymous reports and named reports. People retain their anonymity for many, many reasons. One of the biggest ones is they'd rather do so anonymously initially. So we see that's the most common thing that we see is anonymous disclosures and named disclosures. Sometimes in organisations where we've been working with them to implement that cultural shift, named disclosures than anonymous ones, and where that happens, that's obviously a really positive signal that trust is high in the organisation, because people aren't fearing the repercussions of naming themselves when they speak up about something. But there's definitely a section of organisations who either only get anonymous reports or who don't get any reports at all, and those organizations that aren't receiving any reports at all is not because the culture is positive. It is because it's a real signal that there is a lack of trust for the organisation to do the right thing when those concerns are raised. And that for me is a massive red flag, and ourselves on the back for no reports. We should be going, why don't our people want to speak to us? Because we're interacting with each other, and things will be happening, not through any sort of fault of anyone's, but just because we're a group of people like going about our business, and things will be going wrong because we are fallible human beings. So I think you know, that kind of, that focus on seeing disclosures or reports, and people being confident to report to the organisation is a massive area of best practice. But in most of the time, I would say that that's not the norm. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't, because we only see the ones that go wrong, to be honest with you, Gemma. So
yeah,
I couldn't actually say that, or, you know, as I said, I think a lot of organisations and people within them do a brilliant job. But ultimately, it's about leadership. All of the things I was describing before are activities, but the real thing that underlies trust in any process is leadership, and having leaders who are open, honest, and they say when they can't tell you. Because let's face it, when you whistleblow, there is this idea that you should then become the arbitrator of all of this and decide whether the actions are right or wrong. That's simply not possible, because it's not your job. Your job has been to do the right thing, to speak up about, say, patient safety harm or GDPR breaches, or, you know, the misuse of AI, whatever it may be. But it isn't then, you have no responsibility in what goes forward. It's about the leadership. And that trust is, or lack of trust in the leadership, is demonstrated by the whistleblowers who keep going back over and over again saying, nothing's been done, and I can feel that things have changed for me. So I really think that we have got to get over this hump and talk about leaders and their role in this, because everyone knows the right thing to do, and most people do it. Leadership is more fearless. I think they're afraid of litigation. They're afraid of losing their jobs in the same way that everybody else is. So bringing this piece of legislation actually is that safety net for them too. So
definitely.
That's where all of this sits. And I could see that there's some questions.
Yeah, one of the questions that I was interested in putting to you is it's quite specific, but I think it would be interesting to explore it. What if you bring a consultant in to help your organisation, knowing that you have issues around your speak up policy and its implementation, and then they whistleblow to an external agent while you're trying to do the work to fix things? Have you got any insight or anything into that?
Can I just go back over the question just to make sure I've understood it? So we have a whistleblower. They bring the organisation.
So we have an organisation. We have someone who knows they have issues around their speak up policy and its implementation. They've admitted that they've recognised that there are issues. So they bring in an external consultant to help work through those issues, and then that external agent blows the whistle. Have you ever had that situation before?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's usually then about identifying the people within the process who are blocking it. Back to what I'm saying, this is a great organisation, but because they've recognised that they need independent support to do a review. You know, we all do those things from time to time, but then for that person to have to whistleblow because they are being lent upon, yes, we do see that. We've seen a couple of cases where people have withdrawn and then they've been replaced by a nodding dog, another yes man. And that's where leadership is really important, that the senior leaders need to have that direct line to somebody who's coming in independently, so they can speak without fear or favour and be allowed to do their job. That those people responsible are moved out. And I've got a good example of something where that happened around bullying and harassment, actually. This particular person, we'll call them the bully, was a really high performer. really high. Their team cracked all targets with no trouble whatsoever. And it's a public sector organisation. But they had a huge turnover of staff. And nobody questioned it. 23 years, nobody questioned it. They were known to be difficult, opinionated. They're all of those kind of words that are euphemisms for really bullying or can be. And then we had somebody who came in from a very different background in this story, much more diverse than the office had been. And this person really became the target of this individual in a very nasty way. And it's that person raising their concern outside of the immediate organisation up to a central office that brought about an investigation that identified 23 years of complete neglect by all of these managers who all knew that this person really was a horrendous bully. They were exited, and would you believe that person then succeeded, the bully succeeded in the employment tribunal on the grounds that they'd never been told about their behaviour. And I think that is the right action, but you can see how negative it is. And for everybody looking in, they would just think there's no point speaking up because I'm not going to be listened to, nobody's going to take notice. That's where leadership is important.
Absolutely. It has to be challenged and changed. And I think you know, the work that you're doing is towards making that happen. I'm going to wrap up there and just take a moment to mention a couple of things that we've got coming up. So firstly, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Our next webinar is going to be held at the same time next week. And we'll be talking about protecting those who speak up. You can sign up to that webinar by following the link that's been posted in the chat. In that webinar, we'll be hearing about how you can take actionable steps to creating a safe environment for people to speak up about misconduct, and also hear firsthand about the consequences of failing to hear and support those who speak up. If you're in Manchester next week, then next Wednesday on the 19th, we're going to be hosting our next Northwest Changemakers event, where we'll bring together some senior changemakers across lots of different sectors to network and share best practice in transforming organisational cultures. For your invite, again, follow the link that has been shared in the chat now. And that just leaves me to thank everyone here who has joined today's webinar. And also a big thanks to Georgina Halford-Hall, who is CEO for Whistleblowers UK and the Secretariat of the. Thank you so much for joining us today, Georgina. It's been a fantastic chat.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Lovely to see you all. And if you've got questions still in the chat, more than happy if you ping them over and I'll address them for you.
Definitely. Bye. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.